If you've been following high-end audio for any length of time, you know GoldenEar has carved out this really interesting niche. They're not playing the same game as everyone else in regards to what the traditional two-channel configuration should look like in a number of their designs. While some speaker companies are still arguing about whether you need a subwoofer or not, GoldenEar has basically said, what if we just build it into the tower and call it a day? And that's exactly what they did here. Today we're looking at the T44, their latest hybrid tower that continues the philosophy of the T66 Big Brother, but with some meaningful refinements. After spending considerable time with these in my listening room, I'm going to share my thoughts about whether this approach actually works in practice.
I'm Alan Perkins, lead analog designer for MoFi Electronics, and this is the new Master Deck. What does the turntable sound like? Really nothing. It's a table with a very, very low noise floor, really no background noise. You forget wondering if the speed's stable because it's so stable. You're just listening to the music and enjoying it, and I think the purest form you're going to hear.
So the hybrid concept. Let's talk about what makes these different from your typical tower speaker. The T44 uses what GoldenEar calls a hybrid design. You've got passive components handling the mids and the highs like a traditional speaker, but the bass section has its own built-in amplification. The 5x9 sub that's housed at the bottom here receives power from a 250 watt RMS, 500 watt peak amplifier, and keeping the slim and clean look, it has two 8x12 passive radiators that flank each side. When you think about the powered subregion, I don't want you to just think solely about the additional bass. The low-end extension is there without a doubt, but what I think is even more important is that when you take driving the subwoofer out of the picture, that really takes the load off of your amplifier. Your amplifier only needs to worry about that AMT Tweeter and the 4.5-inch mid-range in this case. That's going to allow you to power these with a really wide range of amplification, as well as improve the general performance of the amplifier. Now about that AMT Tweeter. GoldenEar has been refining their high-velocity folded ribbon design for years, and you can almost hear the maturity in this implementation. One of the many innovations, they've surrounded the tweeter with a felt damping to reduce diffraction. It's a small detail, but it matters when you're chasing every last bit of clarity. The dispersion from this tweeter is generally impressive as well. I'm not talking about just having a wide sweet spot, though it definitely has that too. I'm talking about maintaining tonal consistency as you move around the room. It works fantastically for music, and I have a strong feeling that it's going to carry over into home theater setups as well. We're going to touch on that too in just a little bit here. During my listening sessions, I noticed phantom images appeared behind and around my listening position. Not in a disorienting, I haven't slept in 24 hours way because I have a newborn, but in that, wait, is there a speaker back there kind of way? The soundstage doesn't just go wide, it wraps around you when the recording calls for it. Let's talk about something that everyone wants to know on these. How low do they go? GoldenEar claims 32 Hz in room, but in my space, I was consistently getting a usable output down to about 30 Hz. That's nearing full range performance from a relatively compact tower. The bass isn't simply a plug it in and go situation either, where you just kind of get what you get. You have some control here through a gain dial on the back panel of each speaker. This only adjusts the subwoofer level, not the crossover point. So you're not messing with the integration between the woofer and the mid-range. You're just dialing in how much bass reinforcement you want and tuning it for your particular space and your tastes. In my room, I started at noon on the dial and I ended up around 1 o'clock. Just enough to feel the weight without having the bass call attention to itself. If you want it to call attention to itself though, there's room on the dial and it can definitely do it. The sealed design on those passive radiators give you this controlled articulate bass that doesn't boom or overhang. It's quick enough to keep up with complex bass lines, but it has enough weight to make you feel those low notes. Play something that has a busy track and you won't ever find it trying to completely take over. It's not shaking your walls, the bass just kind of stays in its lane and it's tight enough that the vocals float right above it. Visually, these speakers thread an interesting needle. They're unobtrusive without being boring. That Santa Barbara red finish on my review pair is it's actually stunning. And I need to emphasize this because photos don't capture how beautiful these actually are in person. When I pulled off the protection, seeing that finish for the first time, I actually just said, wow. It's this deep, rich red with subtle metallic speckles that really catch the light. It's the kind of finish that makes you want to install some kind of accent lighting so that you can just show off the cabinet. I do need to comment though, the grille is fixed, so if you're expecting to see the drivers, you're not going to be able to see a whole lot here without close examination. I do have to say though, and this is coming from very much so a grill off kind of guy, the metal mesh grills actually look pretty sharp on these. The shape and just the general blend into the cabinet is executed quite well. The cast aluminum outrigger base is a nice touch. Not only does it look the part on this design, but it's genuinely well engineered. You can adjust the spikes from the top without ever having to tilt the speaker. They supply a special wrench, and it's just a quick change rather than the occasional designs that require the speaker to be tipped up and then adjusted. Once you lock these into place, they're pretty rock solid. Very little wobble, even with their thin profile. At around 40 inches tall and just 7.5 inches wide, they're what I'd call a fit everywhere type of speaker. They're substantial enough to look serious, but not so large that they dominate your room. And it's more than simply the thin profile that makes this a fit anywhere type of speaker. They double down on this with the fact that you won't need to find a home for a sub, or ideally two. When you consider the average sub width is around 16 inches, you're potentially removing 32 inches from the front stage for a pair of subs. For some people, that's not really a big deal, but if you're listening in a small to medium-sized room, that gain in real estate could be a major factor on these. All that being said, the design focus that transcends GoldenEar speakers isn't just about space. That narrow baffle also helps with imaging, reducing diffraction, and keeping the soundstage precise. One of the things I appreciate about the Absolute Sound is it's not a requirement to listen to audiophile test tracks all day. Sure, these recordings have their place and I use them too, but what I really want to focus on these particular speakers is touching on a few different genres that I felt really helped outline their delivery method. Take the Lumineers Ophelia, actually a great speaker test. The lead's voice has this raw, slightly raspy quality that's bad speakers, they're either going to smooth over it or they're going to make it sound kind of harsh. Through the T44s, you get all that texture without it becoming grating. When the drum kicks in after that first verse, they hit with real impact, but they don't overwhelm the mix. The foot stomps that punctuate the rhythm, they sound like actual feet hitting the actual floor, not just undefined thuds from random sources. Switching to something with more production layers, Billie Eilish's Happier Than Ever. Say what you want about pop production, but her tracks generally have a really interesting mix. The whisper quiet opening through the T44s is eerily intimate. You can hear her breath, the subtle room tone, the barely there guitar. Then when it explodes into that full band crescendo at the end, the speakers scale perfectly and the powered subdrivers really showcase the whole idea of big sound, little package. They don't compress, they don't get shouty, they just open up and let it rip. For something a little more aggressive, Queens of the Stone Age, No One Knows. That opening drum pattern needs punch and definition. Through the T44s, you can feel the kick drum in your chest while still hearing the attack. There's this very prominent guitar tone as well, which can sound muddy on lesser speakers. In this case, it easily maintains its edgy character without losing articulation. And when the bass line walks during the verses, it's not just low frequency information, it's actual notes with pitch and timing. One of the advantages we experience here is how well integrated the upper and lower portions of the cabinet are. In systems with separate subs, while it's very doable, it does take more fine-tuning to get this sort of cohesive, integrated type of sound. And here's an example of where that AMT Tweeter really shines. Norah Jones' Come Away With Me. This is one of those recordings where you can tell immediately if a tweeter is doing something wrong. Her voice should sound warm and inviting, not sibilant or thin. The brushwork on the drums needs to sound like actual brushes on actual drums, not just a bunch of white noise. The T44s portray this in a really believable fashion. The AMT in the mid-range also deliver the piano with proper weight and decay. You can almost picture the felt hammers hitting the strings. To touch on home theater a bit, while these clearly perform really well with music, they actually carry the same beat when you bring them over to the home theater side. I couldn't resist trying them with some movie content with how well the sub was doing with the music. Watching the new F1 movie, the first sequence had some serious impact moments. When the cars are bumping into each other, the fireworks are going off overhead, the T44s delivered the kind of punch and growl that you want from a home theater speaker. But more importantly, dialogue stayed crystal clear. Even without a center channel, voices really remained anchored and intelligible, which is something that I always look for in the home theater setting. A little bit more about the bass. Movies are an area where LFE tracks just tend to reign supreme. I really enjoyed what these are capable of doing with such a small profile, but if you're accustomed to 15-inch subs in your home theater, you're still going to need to weigh your expectations a bit. The bass is tight, clean, and even powerful at times, but expect the need for an additional sub if you're looking for tactile subsonic bass. Although I would be curious what the Big Brother T66 could do here as well. If I'm describing you and you have music and home theater aspirations with these, no fear, you can easily bring in an additional sub by splitting the connection at your receiver. It's really not a problem either way. There is some flexibility on the setup on these. The bi-wire terminals on the back give you some options. Leave the jumper in for traditional setups, bridging the treble and the bass. There's also an LFE input if you're going to be using these in a home theater setup or connecting them to a compatible processor. What's sort of interesting about these is the line level input isn't a requirement for the subs. If you simply have the speaker cables plugged in with the jumper in place, the T44s will utilize a special circuit that takes the signal from the speaker level input and converts it to a line level signal that drives the sub amp. You can also utilize the separate LFE for a 0.1 and a 5.1, for example, and have independent control over the LFE volume, which can be really useful for home theater setups. I found the setup was pretty straightforward on these. They aren't particularly fussy about placement, though like any speaker, they benefit from some attention to positioning. I ended up with them about 18 inches from the front wall, with just a slight toe in, I'd say right around a foot outside of my ears. The wide dispersion of that AMT tweeter means you get a wide range to hit that sweet spot. So just get comfortable and play around with it. It's always worth doing this. About the value proposition. At $5,000 for the black finish or $5,300 for this gorgeous Santa Barbara red, these bring an interesting value. And here's what I think about it. You're essentially getting high quality tower speakers plus built-in subwoofers that actually integrate seamlessly. If you were to attempt the exercise of pricing out separate towers and subs that perform at this level, it really makes these look like a smart value. More importantly, they solve real-world problems. Not everyone has space for separate subwoofers. Not everyone wants to deal with integration issues, and not everyone has a massive amplifier. The T44s address all of these concerns while delivering genuinely high-end sound. If I'm being picky, and that's my job, I'd say the grills aren't removable, which might bother some people. Though honestly, these particular grills look good enough that I didn't mind leaving them on. The other consideration is that the speaker does have a power requirement, so there's going to be an additional cable over the speaker cables. In my opinion, it's not really a big deal either. They're likely located in your front stage where subs would have had the same power requirements. But if you're limited on outlet options, it could be something to take note of. The GoldenEar T44s represent a mature evolution of the hybrid tower concept. They're not trying to reinvent the wheel, they're just refining a proven design that solves actual problems for actual listeners. The combination of that refined AMT tweeter, natural mid-range, and near full-range bass in a package of this size, and it's this easy to drive, well, that's just not very common. I would say that these speakers are for people who want high-end sound without high-end complexity. They're for people who want one pair of speakers who can handle everything from, solo piano to electronic music to home theater. They're proof that the hybrid approach, when done right, isn't a compromise. It's just a different path to the same goal. In high-end audio, where complexity often gets confused with quality, it's refreshing, honest engineering. For The Absolute Sound, this is Matt Kuykendall, and if you found this helpful or at least entertaining, please consider subscribing. There's a lot of great content on the way. Talk soon. Take care. Later.